Hello, and this is Identities Conversations with Nyarima Shayamombe, where we talk about important issues that affect our lives, issues of policy, accountability, governance, issues that enables us to ask our leaders what is going on in our communities, issues that are important to us. And to kickstart this season today, I want us to talk about the situation of education in Zimbabwe. We know that the government made an announcement that schools could open, but also only for the exam classes. And so there's something that's happening that warranted this conversation. Because as many of you will know, that I have been also advocating for basic state-funded education so that no child is left behind. Because before COVID-19, more than 30% of kids could not go to school because they could not afford school fees, levies, and everything. And then we pushed for a law that would allow kids to be allowed into school if they didn't have school fees, because according to the Constitution, Section 75, every child has a right to have access to state-funded basic education. So what that means for me is that every child must not be hindered for whatever reason. That's according to the Constitution, that's according to the conventions that Zimbabwe signed within Africa, that's according to international conventions that Zimbabwe signed again, which are international. So it is warranted, this conversation, because as schools are opening, the government announced that there are some schools that may not be open because avana mvura akula manzi, there is no water. And so the government, in light of COVID-19, they've said that if a school is not well ready to open, that school is not opening. But what is problematic is that some schools are opening. Some schools are opening. These same schools that have exam classes, whether your school ilikuwa Kitsiadona or your school ilikuwa Zana, what is there is that if your school is well equipped, you are able to go to school. If your school is not well equipped, you can't go to school. Despite the fact that you can register, despite the fact that you register to write examinations, that is problematic actually. That is problematic in the sense that what the government is simply saying is that there are kids who had already been catered for, kids whose schools were better resourced, and those kids are allowed to continue in school. Those kids are allowed to continue with their education. Those kids are allowed to go and prepare for exams. But if your school was poorly funded, if your school was already excluded, if the government had not paid attention to resourcing your school, you cannot go to school. My guy, you are supposed to stay at home. In other words, your right to education is not guaranteed in this country. That is problematic, citizens, because it is the responsibility of the government according to Section 75 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. And now, according to the Education Amendment Act, there must never be discrimination against children. There must never be discrimination against anybody when it comes to access to state-funded basic education. Now, we must speak out, just as I'm doing, as citizens, that we find that problematic. It is the responsibility of the state. Kuona kuti schools anemvura. Before schools opened, every school was supposed to be ready. That is the inclusive education, that is to ensure that every child has access to education. But when a state fails to equip schools, for example, and says amuvure, it means that trukuramba tichiwaidena, the gap between the better schools and poor schools. We are shutting out poor. So you find that the schools where they are unable to open are the schools which do not have classrooms, which do not have electricity, which do not have water, which most of the times do not have teachers who are not equipped. So now it is unthinkable and unacceptable for a whole government to tell us that schools are sina mvura, the very poor schools cannot open. It is unthinkable, it is discriminatory, it is unconstitutional, it is breaking and it is breaking and violating the rights of the children. So if a child is ikoko kwa kids kwatataura kwekuya kune ma schools asina mvura, they are saying vana vari kuma poor schools, vana vane ma schools asina kuiswa ne government kuti vave ne access to education, ngava ivo ngavagare vari kunze. So it is discrimination, it's illegal. So I'm just here to say that as citizens, we must be able to hold our local leaders accountable. We must be able to go to our council and demand that council does its job, make sure that there's water at every school. But I think it would have been wiser for the government to not have opened schools until every child had access to education. So if the whole government knew that there are schools that are ill prepared, they must have equipped those schools to make sure that they are equally ready. Kune majojo, matanks anotengeswa, kune balls that could be drilled. But why is it that we're allowing our children to be shut out of school? Why is it that we're allowing our children to be vulnerable outside of school? So I think for me, the conversation needs to be had around the responsibility of the government, around the government understanding that they cannot perpetuate discrimination as the government itself. They cannot open schools while other schools are shut out, and I think that it's unacceptable. And I think that if you know a school that's shut out right now, you must reach out to us. Kana kune ma schools amunoziva akavhara, munofana kuti contacta pama numbers amuri kuona pa screen pedu, pa Facebook pedu, pa WhatsApp pedu, pama text messages, because I think as every child in school, personally, as I indicated earlier on, as a champion of state-funded basic education, I think we want to also make an opportunity to gather evidence to say, especially for our members of parliament in those communities where my schools are shut, it's the role of the member of parliament to stand for you in parliament to make sure that whatever announcements or pronouncements that the government makes, vachita mitemo yavo kana kuti mapositions avanotora se cabinet, as well as parliament, my members of parliament edu, my councillors edu, they must represent the interests of people. They must represent the interests of children. No child should be left out.
Yeah. Inini semuonero wangu ndikuona unge kuti zvikoro zvirambe zvakavharwa asikuita. Yet yes, kune mamwe maschools ari better anokwanisa kuoffer ma services nekuisa ma sanitizer nechichi nekuti wane mari. But chatinofanira kuita ndechekutoti I think se imimo wenhepenyuro nemamwe ma organizations anomirira wana munofanira kuadvertisa radio, press, tokwanisa kuwana mamwe ma companies. Temamwe ma companies are willing kusponsor zvikoro zvisina mari yakakwana kuti wakwanisa kutenga ma sanitizer nema testing kits. But futhi ndamonzwa nawe kuti vabereki vanofanira kuassista kuti vanobvisa a certain amount vachipawo maticha kuti maticha akwanise kuuya kuzodzidzisa wana. But we should also to consider kuti kune mamwe mafamilies ari kutostruggle even kutotenga anything mumba mavo. Hawatokwanisa kuona kana 2 years chaiyo kuita something. Saka zvine zvakudisadvantage those families nevana vanobva ikoko. And at the end of the day tozongopedza tangoti wane mari ndo vanokwanisa kungoacquire education, pasina mari hapasina chakukwanisa kuitika. Saka yes, wana vanofanira kudzokera kuchikoro, but tinofanira kuliaisa nemamwe maorganizations anoassista wana nemamwe macompanies wasubsidiza kuzvikoro kuti tikwanise kuti wakwanise kuti maticha akwanise kuwana zvaari kuda, then wanawo wechikoro wakwanise kuti wadzidze wasiri at risk yekuconducta madisease chirwere chiripo cheCovid-19.
Super issue ye-education to nepfungwa dzangu ndofunga kuti vana vanofanira kuenda kuchikoro kwete kumira kuenda kuchikoro. But nenyaya yekuti pane chirwere cheCovid, so ndochine limit ndochine challenge yatusangana nayo kuti government yedu kuti ofe masanitize chichichi zviri kunetsa. But apa pautongoda idea yekuti vabereki vasimuke nesolution yekuti ubatsirana woita macontribution ubhadhara mateachers nokutengawo tumwe tumasanitize and then government yozoassistawo zvimwe zvacho at least zvine zviri nani because what we consider education yevana vechikoro ndo iri more important iyo ende ndo yatiri kuda etoti vana vangoswera vachitengerera plus vana vakatadza kudzidzaka nezire yacho makurorwa vachiri vadiki nekuroorwa vachiri vadiki because kana vakati vagara hapana chavanokwanisa kuita saka vana ngavaende kuzvikoro tozwawo tsitsi nevana vakagara kana isusu tichitoriwo vana taitodawo kutoenda kuchikoro but hapana tatongopfekawo zvimaweksuit hapana vana ngavaende kuzvikoro ndo chakakosha ichocho saka situation iyi tiritonzwawo tsitsi vabereki ngavachitongo zvakaoma but yatongova sacrifice tongoti vanokwanisawo wongoita maagreements wobhadhara mateachers acho and then vana votanga kuenda kuchikoro vanaona education. I think that's it.
So I think it is our responsibility as citizens, and it's our right as citizens to rise up and say, government, you cannot impose unrealistic things. You cannot impose discriminatory measures against other kids. There are kids who were learning during COVID-19. They had lessons online and on radio and on TV. But we know there are kids who don't own radios and televisions, and the kids, where they come from, there is no connectivity, even if their parents had TVs or radio stations. So what we are seeing here is that the continued gap between the rich and the poor. The government is just, conveniently issuing out, but without addressing the real issues of discrimination, without addressing the real issues of marginalizations and gaps that exist between the rich and the poor, the poorly equipped schools and those that are not equipped schools, and so I think it's problematic and we must speak about it. We're taking a break. When you come back, we're going to discuss further about the situation of children in those schools that have actually opened. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Identities Conversations, where we're talking about important issues that affect your life and mine, issues about governance, accountability, issues about policy. And today, my conversation with you is about the issue and situation of education ever since the lifting of lockdowns in schools, where we said the government has already started having kids according to exam classes, and currently we have exam classes in schools. And in the previous segment, I spoke about how the government pronounced that schools that do not have water will not be opening, and we're just reiterating the fact that, wait a minute, it is supposed to be the government that is supposed to provide that water in the first place, and no child should have to be left behind. And I personally think that according to the constitution and according to the laws of this country and according to our expectation of our government, no child should be left behind, whether you go kuchikoro chisina or what. It is the responsibility of the government to have seen to it that every school is equipped to begin or to open. So I was just giving that background, and I was inviting you guys to engage your councils, to engage your leaders, to engage your members of parliament, to say, why is it that our schools are shut? It is the responsibility of government, it is the responsibility of leadership. But as schools have opened, there's been a shocking, concerning trend in the schools. Because teachers are not in schools, because teachers are on go slow, our kids have become more vulnerable, and there's been pictures on social media of students posing in suggestive, inappropriate positions, boys and girls in the schools. Who knows what else they're doing? We're just seeing some still pictures, but there are even others who are saying that kids may be engaging in sex even in our schools because they're going unmonitored. This is not information that's been verified, but judging with what we are seeing with our students, we must be worried. And I think that just talking to a lot of people, there's good feedback. I mean, there's feedback that's coming from citizens who have been saying that maybe the government must close schools until they've sorted out the issue of teachers. We cannot have our students in classes where there's nobody monitoring. Kids cannot, they are minors, for crying out loud. That's why we say below the age of 18, they do not know for the better part what they're doing, the risks that they're faced with. So there are some of this the school of thought that the government must close the schools until they are serious about addressing the issues of teacher welfare, where teachers are actually on strike right now, and the teachers are complaining that the amounts they are being paid cannot sustain them even going to work, cannot sustain even them feeding their families, bus fare to work and all that. So it's understandable that considering that we now have a parallel market where there's the US dollars and the RTGS, it's to be considered that our teachers feel that they are not well paid, or they are not even meeting the minimum datum line to be able to feed their families. But I think the conversation, I am just here to talk about what's going on with teachers, but I think the biggest concern for me is having kids unmonitored in schools, especially after an entire 6 months lockdown, where kids were just at home. Now they're with each other, and as I said, pictures are already been seen, and a lot of our kids are not as much educated around comprehensive sexuality education. The situation, and also, not before we even go, they want to talk about the pictures that are going around online. These are kids, some of them, most of them are below the age of 18. They do not understand the impact of the pictures that they're sending out of themselves, posing in in suggestive ways, in appropriate ways. And so maybe if there's a kid who's watching this, I need to let you know that you're being stupid. You need to stop it. You need to stop taking pictures, posing in compromising situations, because when you grow up, when you want to look for jobs, and you cannot take away those pictures, they are already circulating, your face is out there. But I also want to appeal to mature people that you cannot be an adult and release a child's picture without covering their faces online. It's illegal. You can actually be arrested for that. So let's be careful about other people's children. If it was your child, you'd never do that. You would never release an image on WhatsApp or on Facebook with a child uncovered. We understand you want to share that information. We understand you want for all of us to know. But what you basically need to do is cover, shade, paint that picture of a child so that we can't see their face, and then you can share. It's acceptable. We need to know what's going on in the schools. So we need you to actually to protect children. If you are releasing children, the parents can sue. They can sue you for exposing minors, for exposing children in compromising. It's our responsibility as adults to protect children. But just coming back to the situation of children being in schools unmonitored, I think that's it could be something very irresponsible, that as parents, as citizens, as people, we must actually speak out. We understand the government may be doing whatever it has to do, talking to teachers, engaging teachers, but we can't have our kids in schools unmonitored. We've also seen that some teachers are using kids. Kids have been away from school for 6 months. They're supposed to be learning. If you can't teach them, then don't use them. I do not understand how agriculture can come into the classroom and that is abuse of power, that is abuse of our children, and we say children should not be abused. And we expect the Ministry of Education to take a position about such school authorities that are allowing that to happen, and also such teachers that are abusing our children. And if your child goes to such school, I think you've got a right to actually raise that and say, no, we cannot have our kids be used like that. We cannot have kids be abused like that. But most fundamentally speaking, our kids are at risk in schools if teachers' issues are not treated urgently. And I think as parents, as citizens, we've got a right to call on the government to make sure that teachers' welfare are addressed, because I'm not going to stay here and say, or sit here and say, remove kids in school. It's their right to be back in school. So the government must do everything. It must make sure that teachers' welfare are addressed urgently so that kids continue with their education without being prejudiced, without having to suffer anything. So we encourage the government to immediately address the situation of teachers so that kids are safe in school, so that kids do not have to come back from school kunogara kumba futi asifuni konoko. We want the government to fix indaba yama-teacher so that teachers go back to class, so that kids go to register, so that kids get to be prepared for their examination. So we're calling for the government to make sure that kids are safe in schools, kids continue being in school, and also most importantly that they're protected in school, they are safe in school. We're taking a quick break. We'll be back soon.
The question is, the teachers are striking and want to know what the government should do about it. I don't really think the government can do anything because they don't really care about just the average person in Zim. It's evident by the way they've been going about their business. So I think it's better for the teachers to just elevate themselves and their crafts and make it hard for the government to actually refuse to pay them. Like, I think it's in Poland. If you want to be a teacher, you have to have like a master's degree, I think. So I think that the teachers should just rally together and make it so that all of them are so qualified and so good at their jobs that the government has no choice but to pay them, because the education system has been failing for some time now. And I don't really think we can blame the government because they're not the ones that teach. It's the teacher's job to teach. And if they're saying they're teaching and people aren't really passing, then there's an issue there that needs to be fixed. That's what I think. So at the end of the day, your employer will only pay you what they think you're worth. And if the government thinks that if you have a diploma or if you're straight out of high school and you're teaching, which teaching is a very important job because everyone needs a teacher to be where they are right now. If the government feels like you're not worth the amount of money you're asking for, or your qualifications aren't worth the amount of money you're asking for, there's really not much you can do to change their opinion except to get yourself to a place where you are worth what you're asking for.
My name is Timothy Swanda, and I think this issue kuti teachers kubatika kuchikoro, I think the government must increase their salary vangobetserekawo since kuine strike, saka zvandomunofunga.
Welcome back to Identities Conversations, where today I'm talking about the issue of education and situation in our schools, and I spoke about how it's unfair for certain schools to be said, oh, because you don't have water you can't open. It's the responsibility of the government to make sure that every school has water, and if there are schools that are shut out, it's illegal. It's actually discriminating against children whose schools were not facilitated. So we can't accept that. We cannot accept that. We are calling on the government to make sure that every school is open, because the same exams, they are not going to be easier exams for kids whose schools do not have water or were closed, to say, oh, because you were closed and you didn't prepare for your exams, therefore your exams are going to be easier. So it is the responsibility of the government. It is a failure, an acknowledgement of failing if the government says that schools should be closed. And we've also called to say, if you know of a school that's closed, if you know of a school that's not open right now, please let us know. Secondly, I spoke about how vulnerable kids are in school because teachers are not in schools. After a long time of not going to school, for 6 months, kids are faced with teachers who are not in school, and we've been seeing circulating pictures of kids who are compromised. We are worried about our girls, especially. and our boys, of course, because at the end of the day, they're both children, they're both minors, and we're worried that the girls are going to get pregnant, they're going to get sexually transmitted diseases, and they are going to be ruining their life, because if a girl is going to be pregnant and a mother, it's going to affect her progress. We know that a lot of girls who fall pregnant, the chances of them continuing with education is very difficult, are very slim. But then even if they're continuing, they would have lost a year or two without going to school. So we are saying the government must put in place urgent measures to make sure that kids are protected in school, to make sure that they are ready for their exams. So as we round up this conversation today, I just want to hear what you think. I want to hear what you think, because from where I'm standing, from the legal point of view, it is the responsibility of the government to make sure that kids have teachers in school, to make sure that every school is equipped, to make sure that every child has access to education, and hence our campaign, Every Child in School. So if you live in a community where kids are not in school, you must engage your counselors, you must engage your members of parliament. What is their job? What are they doing in parliament? If they live in a community where kids are not going to school, if they live in a community where there's a school that's closed, if they live in a community where teachers are not in school and kids are vulnerable, because nobody is monitoring them. So I think it is a call for our citizens to demand accountability from our government that we put in place, just like I put government is up in place. So we are asking the government to be responsible. We're asking the government to make sure that every school is equipped, every child has access to education, that we never leave anyone behind, we leave no child behind. We make sure that we equip every school with water, with boreholes, in that teachers' welfares are looked after, so that teachers urgently get back to school, because we cannot accept kids going back home because it's no longer COVID. COVID is being mitigated. The government must mitigate COVID by ensuring water, by ensuring all the other stuff that is needed to make sure that kids are safe from COVID-19, but also most importantly, making sure that the teachers are in school to monitor that even as kids are in school, they are practicing social distancing, they are practicing good hygiene to make sure that we don't spread even coronavirus, but also most importantly, that our students are prepared for the examinations that are coming. If the government cannot make sure that every child has access to education, then I mean it's only obvious that it must look itself in the mirror and say, are we managing or we are failing? So until next time, folks, you are hearing from other voices, from yourselves, from the citizens who are in the community. We want to hear from you. Get in touch with us. Have a good one.